Hi, and welcome to the Green Mosaic podcast. We're here to transform something that affects us all, the climate crisis. Green Mosaic works towards raising awareness of intersectional climate justice, a framework which recognizes that overlapping systems of oppression, such as social injustice, create disproportionate vulnerabilities to climate impacts. Yet despite this reality, conversations around the climate crisis are dominated by voices and frameworks that overlook or oversimplify these sinister forces. We're here to change that. In this podcast, we will showcase a vibrant mosaic of solutions for bold climate action that tackles systemic oppression and inequality at its very roots. Together, we can raise awareness of intersectional climate justice and transform that awareness into positive climate action. I'm Hannah, your host, and you can find me on socials at Hannah for Climate, and you can find this podcast at Green Mosaic. Thanks for listening. The climate emergency is already here, and it's getting worse, fast. We all know what's at stake, but many are still figuring out how to shape a future that protects both people and our shared planet. If you've heard the phrase climate justice before and wondered what it really means, you came to the right place. If you dream of a sustainable future that is fair and inclusive, but aren't sure how we get there, stay tuned because that's what this episode is all about. Today we're going to cover the big question. What is intersectional climate justice? Why does it matter? And what does it look like to communities on the front lines? In this episode, we will explore different systems of oppression, including sexism, racism, classism, ableism, and heteronormativity, to better understand intersectionality. This exploration will expand your understanding of the climate crisis and arm you with the tools to engage in meaningful climate action. We will discuss how these intersecting forces shape the impacts of climate change and the solutions needed for a sustainable future that is fair and inclusive. So let's dive into it. Intersectionality is a framework that Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist scholar and activist, developed in 1989 to help us understand how our identities overlap and intersect to create unique, multifaceted experiences of privilege and discrimination. Initially, she applied it to the intersection between misogyny and anti-Black racism because it was imperative to examine the two together in order to articulate the experiences of Black women. She has described it as, quote, a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects, end quote. Since then, it's been embraced by multiple communities, each with their own definition. The United Nations has offered a definition, and it describes intersectionality as a framework which, quote, recognizes that people's lives are shaped by their identities, relationships, and social factors. These combine to create intersecting forms of privilege and oppression, depending on a person's context and existing power structures, such as patriarchy, ableism, colonialism, imperialism, homophobia, and racism. End quote. Intersectionality has become one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding climate change. Because here's the truth that often gets missed in mainstream climate conversations. The climate crisis doesn't affect everyone equally, not even close. The people who have done the least to cause this crisis are the ones suffering the most from it. Think about that for a moment. According to Oxfam, the world's wealthiest 10% of people are responsible for around 50% of global carbon emissions. But the poorest 50% of humanity? Well, they are just responsible for 10%. And yet it's low-income communities, overwhelmingly made up of people of color, who are on the front lines of floods, droughts, heat waves, and rising seas. So intersectional climate justice takes that observation and goes deeper. It asks, why? What systems created this situation, and who needs to be at the center of the solutions? Intersectional climate justice recognizes that overlapping systems of oppression, such as racism, ableism, classism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, and transphobia, don't just make some people's lives harder in general. They create very specific, measurable, and often deadly vulnerabilities to climate impacts. And to quote from Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. An academic review published in March 2025 in the journal Climate Policy put it clearly. People's identities across different axes, for example, gender, class, ethnicity, age, ability, sexuality, and citizenship, all determine how they experience climate change. And many of the interventions designed to deal with the climate crisis can further increase existing inequalities if we're not careful. To quote from the renowned intersectional environmentalist Leah Thomas, "The Earth shouldn't be taken for granted, nor should its people. And the drivers of this exploitation, greed, racism, capitalism, and other systems of oppression, should be rejected and dismantled. If we combine social justice efforts with environmental awareness efforts, we will harness enough power, representation, and momentum to have a shot at protecting our planet and creating equity at the same time." End quote. Let's look at sexism and climate vulnerability first. The numbers speak for themselves. According to the United Nations, women and girls are 14 times more likely to die in a climate-related disaster than men. Women and girls make up 80% of people displaced by climate change, and 47.8 million more women and girls face food insecurity and hunger than men. Looking forward, the United Nations predicts that by 2050, climate change may push up to 158 million more women and girls into poverty. This is 16 million more than the equivalent figure for men and boys. The reasons are structural and based on socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental factors. Persistent social norms of female subordination and unequal power relations cause women and girls to be more vulnerable to climate change. Women's caregiving roles also heighten their exposure to health risks like heat stress, malnutrition, and waterborne diseases, compounded by systemic gender inequalities that limit their capacity to adapt to the conditions at hand. In many regions, particularly across Africa and Asia, women bear the primary responsibility for securing food, water, and fuel for their families. When climate change makes those resources scarcer, women work harder and travel farther to obtain them. Girls often drop out of school to assume caregiving responsibilities. Climate change also significantly impacts the health outcomes of women and girls. For example, maternal and newborn health is adversely affected by climate change, as pregnant women and newborns are particularly vulnerable to heat stress, extreme weather, and air pollution. In 2022, when catastrophic floods hit Pakistan, nearly 650,000 pregnant women and girls were left without access to adequate health care. On top of all this, the climate crisis makes women and girls more vulnerable to gender-based violence. Research shows that the poverty and conflict following climate disasters leads to more sexual violence, human trafficking, and child marriage. One projection by the United Nations suggests that by the end of this century, climate change could be linked to 1 in every 10 cases of intimate partner violence. The negative impacts of climate change are not uniform even among women. Indigenous women, women of color, disabled women, transgender women, migrant women, and older women all face compounded vulnerabilities to the climate emergency. For example, the social stigma and discrimination that transgender women face limits their access to essential health services during climate disasters. The good news is that gender equality leads to better climate outcomes for everyone. This was proven to be the case by a 2024 study published in BMC Public Health, which found a clear linear connection between gender equality and climate adaptation across 146 countries. This clearly shows that when women are empowered and included in decision-making, climate resilience goes up. It's undeniable that gender equality and climate solutions are two sides of the same coin. We should also remember that we've repeatedly seen women prove themselves to be among the most powerful forces in positive climate action. For example, Professor Wangari Maathai's Greenbelt movement in Kenya has planted over 51 million seeds and created opportunities for 30,000 Kenyan women since 1977. Now let's take a look at how racism and white supremacy make people of color more vulnerable to climate impacts. Here in the UK, research by the Race Equality Foundation finds that on average, people of color in Britain are more affected by the climate crisis than white people. Let's take air pollution as an example. Air pollution is a serious health hazard, and according to Greenpeace, the highest levels of air pollution in the UK are concentrated in neighborhoods where the residents are predominantly people of color. For example, there is a neighborhood in London called Newham, and Newham has the smallest percentage of white residents of any local authority. Only 29% of Newham's residents are white, and Newham is home to London City Airport, which has brought severe health risks and environmental damage to the neighborhood. This is a classic example of a sacrifice zone, where an ethnically diverse community bears the brunt of the noise, air pollution, and health consequences of infrastructure that primarily benefits white communities. Black Lives Matter has also called this out and draws a direct line between aviation expansion, air quality, and racial injustice. The global picture is even more devastating. A joint report by Greenpeace UK and the Runnymede Trust called Confronting Injustice says that the global north has been responsible for over 90% of all historical greenhouse gas emissions, which are largely responsible for the climate crisis we face today. At the same time, the polluting countries have pocketed the profits and failed to sufficiently invest in a just transition. Today, the average person in the UK emits more carbon in 2 weeks than the average resident of Malawi, Ethiopia, or Uganda does in an entire year. The people least responsible for creating the climate crisis are somehow at the front lines of the emergency. That's not entirely an accident. It's the consequence of white supremacy, neocolonialism, and capitalism. The climate emergency and racial injustice are the same crisis. We can't address one without addressing the other. Climate action that doesn't consider race is incomplete at best and harmful at worst. Now let's turn to class inequality. Here in the UK, class inequality has a profound impact on both the root causes of the climate crisis, as well as its effects on low-income communities. Class inequality can be defined as the unequal distribution of wealth, power, opportunities, and resources among different social groups within a society. The energy sector is an illustrative example of this. The UK-based organization Global Justice Now estimates fossil fuel companies receive £17.5 billion in annual subsidies and support from UK taxpayers. Meanwhile, an investigation by Unite the Union found that energy companies made £30 billion in profits in just 1 year, with every household paying around £500 on its annual bill to fund those profits. A spokesperson for the End Fuel Poverty Coalition commented that, quote, "At a time where energy debt is soaring and millions are living in cold, damp homes, it cannot be right that the system continues to prioritize corporate profits over people's health and well-being." End quote. At the same time, National Energy Action estimates that approximately 6 million UK households are currently in fuel poverty, unable to afford to heat their homes to a temperature needed to keep warm and healthy. A 2 million household increase since 2021. Measures to reduce fuel poverty, such as justice-centered approaches to energy pricing and suitable investment in renewable energy, would simultaneously alleviate the climate crisis and reduce the financial burden on vulnerable, low-income communities. If fossil fuel subsidies were redirected to renewable energy, people in the UK could benefit from affordable, domestically produced energy that is not subject to global price fluctuations. The energy crisis is one of many examples that illustrate the interconnections between resolving the climate emergency, whilst challenging and transforming root causes of oppression, such as class inequality. People living with mental and physical disabilities are also disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis. Natural disasters disrupt access to healthcare services, medications, oxygen, and medical devices. Heat waves are linked with higher rates of emergency room visits, hospital admittance, and mortality for individuals living with disabilities. High temperatures also negatively affect the health of individuals whose disabilities are affected by temperature sensitivity. Similarly, many medications, including antidepressants, can affect the ability of people living with disabilities to regulate their internal temperature. Research by Harvard University's Center for the Environment has found that people living with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured in climate emergencies, including heat waves, hurricanes, and floods. In the UK specifically, a 2025 briefing by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology clearly states that people living with disabilities and people of color are more likely to be adversely impacted by climate change, and that the climate crisis exacerbates existing health inequalities. To make matters worse, climate mitigation and adaptation plans are often developed without consulting people living with disabilities and lead to the creation of additional barriers. For example, when evacuations are called, accessible transport often isn't available. Emergency shelters themselves often aren't accessible either. This happens despite the advocacy of organized groups. For example, Disability Rights UK has submitted climate statements to COP27, COP28, and COP29, and showcased their film on disability and climate change at COP30. People living with disabilities are not passive victims. They are experts and advocates. So far, we've talked about how race, gender, class, and disability all shape a person's vulnerability to the climate crisis. Now we want to shine a light on LGBTQIA+ communities, as they are often marginalized in mainstream climate discourse, even though they face a unique and compounding set of climate-related risks. This lack of attention is itself a form of injustice. The climate crisis and LGBTQIA+ rights are not separate issues. They are rooted in the same systems of oppression, systems that concentrate power, exclude marginalized people from decision-making, and prioritize certain lives over others. We're going to look at some of the main mechanisms through which LGBTQIA+ people experience climate vulnerability. For example, LGBTQIA+ people are rendered more vulnerable to climate impacts through housing insecurity. Research shows that almost 1 in 5 LGBTQIA+ people in the UK have been unhoused at some point in their lives. For trans people, that figure rises to 1 in 4. According to AKT, a leading LGBTQIA+ charity in the UK, 77% of the young people they support became unhoused because they were forced out of their family home after coming out or being outed. They lost access to a basic human right just for being who they are. And here is where the climate connection crystallizes. Being unhoused is one of the most dangerous positions you can be in when climate-related disasters strike. Heat waves, flooding, storms all hit people without safe shelter the hardest. The LGBTQIA+ community's higher rates of housing insecurity mean they are structurally more exposed to the physical impacts of a warming world. In 2024, UCLA released its findings on climate change and LGBTQIA+ communities, adding further evidence that confirms their climate vulnerabilities. LGBTQIA+ people face persistent discrimination in housing, employment, education, and accessing public services. Those compounding disadvantages create unique vulnerabilities to climate impacts. For example, LGBTQIA+ people of color are 3 times more likely than white, straight, cisgender people to live below the poverty line. There's a devastating real-world example of what happens to LGBTQIA+ people when climate disasters hit without adequate protections in place. When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005, LGBTQIA+ people faced discrimination in disaster relief. The Federal Emergency Management Agency in the U.S. did not legally recognize same-sex couples as families. That meant LGBTQIA+ households were excluded from or deprioritized in resource distribution. Families were separated during resettlement. Couples couldn't apply for relief aid together. And much of the private disaster relief was run through religiously affiliated organizations that had a documented history of denying services to LGBTQIA+ people. Now that we've dived into some of the most powerful systems of oppression which compound the vulnerability of various communities to climate change, we're going to turn to the solutions. So what does justice look like? And how can we implement the steps that create positive climate action without exacerbating the various systems of oppression out there? The first thing we have to do as a collective is listen. Marginalized communities have centuries of experience building resilience in the face of systems designed to exclude them. That wisdom belongs at the heart of climate action. Their wisdom should not be a footnote, nor should it be included as part of a box-ticking exercise. Rather, community wisdom is to be listened to and integrated into positive climate action at every level. Secondly, we need to raise visibility. Every climate policy, every disaster preparedness plan, every adaptation framework needs to explicitly name and consider how it mitigates against white supremacy, sexism, classism, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia in order to protect communities which face compounded vulnerabilities. Thirdly, our leaders need to recognize that the extraordinary organizations led by vulnerable groups working hard to dismantle systems of oppression and alleviate the climate crisis would make excellent partners as they bring expertise and unique insights to the table. These organizations would also benefit from increased resources as they are often chronically underfunded. Together, we can take these steps and integrate them into positive climate action as a living, breathing part of a vibrant mosaic of solutions. Thank you for listening to this episode of our Green Mosaic on intersectional climate justice. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps our Green Mosaic get into more eyes and into more ears. Please check the show notes for links to the key resources relied on in this episode. For more from us, visit us on socials at our Green Mosaic. I'm Hannah, your host, and you can find me on socials at Hannah for Climate. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode.